Picture this. It's 1789, and you're a French peasant walking past the Palace of Versailles. Through the gilded gates, you catch a glimpse of Queen Marie Antoinette playing dress-up as a poor milkmaid in her custom-built fake village, complete with pristine cottages and hired staff pretending to be shepherds. Meanwhile, you've just spent 90% of your income on a single loaf of bread, and your government is so broke, it's issuing paper money backed by confiscated church property. Welcome to the French Revolution, one of the most spectacular financial meltdowns in European history, where a kingdom's economic incompetence became so legendary that people started chopping off heads as a last-ditch budget correction. How does the most powerful monarchy in Europe manage to bankrupt itself so thoroughly that its own citizens decide that executing the king is a reasonable solution to a spreadsheet problem? The answer is a masterclass in almost every financial mistake a state can make, all happening at the same time, with a generous layer of aristocratic stupidity on top. If you like watching history explain exactly how bad money decisions eventually end in riots, guillotines, and new regimes, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next disaster we autopsy on this channel. Let me tell you about a tax system that would make a mafia protection racket blush with shame. Imagine living with two roommates who own most of the apartment, eat all the food, use all the Wi-Fi, and then calmly hand you the entire stack of bills every month. That is more or less how France worked in the 18th century. The kingdom was divided into three estates. The first estate, the clergy, owned around 10% of all French land and paid essentially no taxes because, apparently, divine service came with a permanent tax exemption. The second estate, the nobility, controlled roughly a quarter of the land and also contributed almost nothing because their ancestors had fought for France centuries earlier, and hereditary military service had somehow turned into a multi-generational tax credit. That left the third estate, which was everyone else from the poorest peasants to the wealthiest merchants and bankers, about 97% of the population, to fund the entire state. They were slammed with the tail, a land tax that mysteriously did not apply to people with titles. They paid the gabels, a salt tax so hated it could start an argument in an empty room. On top of that, they still paid tithes to the church, because nothing says charity quite like forcing the poor to finance your marble altars and gold candlesticks. This wasn't just unfair taxation. It was a kind of slow-motion financial suicide. You cannot sustain a major European power by draining the people who produce and work while the classes who own the land and wield political power skate by untouched. The math is simple. When those with the most wealth contribute the least, your fiscal system becomes a vampire that refuses to bite anyone important. And somehow, it still manages to get worse. After being thoroughly humiliated by Britain in the 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763, France was eager for payback. When American colonists began their rebellion, King Louis XVI saw a chance to wound Britain without directly invading it. Starting in 1778, France became the main external supporter of the American Revolution, sending money, troops, and ships across the Atlantic. Strategically, it worked. America won independence, Britain was embarrassed, and France enjoyed a moment of smug satisfaction. But there was a problem. They had financed this entire revenge operation with money they did not have. The American adventure cost France over 1 billion livres, more than double its annual state revenue. To keep the show going, Finance Minister Jacques Necker did not touch noble or clerical privileges. Instead, he borrowed heavily on international markets, effectively putting the American Revolution on France's national credit card and keeping the statements out of sight. By the 1780s, more than half of France's yearly budget was going just to pay interest on its debts. they had managed to financially cripple themselves in order to humble their rival. It is hard to find a clearer example of revenge being a dish served with a side of bankruptcy. Meanwhile, Marie Antoinette was turning bad optics into an art form. While the French state hurtled toward insolvency, she transformed Versailles into a symbol of tone-deaf excess. Her personal spending became famous. Towering hairstyles that required engineering to hold up, wardrobes that cost more than a farmer would earn in a lifetime, and gambling losses that could have funded entire villages. Her most infamous project was the Hameau de la Reine, a model village built on the grounds of Versailles where she and her friends could dress as peasants, milk cows, and play at simple country life, before strolling back to palaces and multi-course dinners. This was not just standard rich person extravagance. It was a staged fantasy of poverty performed within sight of real poverty. The famous line, "Let them eat cake," is almost certainly a myth, but the fact that people believe she could have said it shows how she was perceived, as someone for whom mass hunger was a distant inconvenience. She became the human symbol of a monarchy disconnected from the economic suffering of its own population. Now let's talk about bread. Your modern budget has rent, utilities, streaming services, and the occasional impulse purchase. For a Parisian commoner in the 1780s, the budget had one central item: bread. In a normal year, an urban worker might spend around half of their income just to buy enough bread to keep their family alive. When bread prices moved, it wasn't about comfort. It was about survival. In the years leading up to 1789, the French state decided to flirt with liberal economic ideas while nature piled on. In 1786, France signed the Eden Treaty, a commercial agreement with Britain that opened markets and brought in cheaper British manufactured goods. Local industries, especially textiles, suffered, and workers lost jobs. Then nature delivered a 1-2 punch. Poor harvests, including a terrible winter in 1788, preceded by a summer of droughts and hailstorms, crushed grain output. Bread prices did not just drift upward, they spiked. By the spring of 1789, that rough 50% share of income spent on bread was closer to 90% for many workers. At that point, there is no remaining margin. People were not just poor, they were on the edge of starvation. Starving people do not spend much time debating constitutional theory. They riot, they loot bakeries, and they start listening to anyone who promises that the entire system can be overturned. Louis XVI eventually understood that the monarchy's finances were in deep trouble. Charles Alexandre de Calonne, his finance minister, devised a plan that truly was revolutionary for its time. A general land tax applied to all property owners, regardless of estate. That meant clergy and nobles would, in theory, finally pay. It was desperate, but it was also rational. The king, anxious about imposing such changes unilaterally, called together the Assembly of Notables in 1787, a select group of 144 high-ranking nobles, church leaders, and officials. The hope was that showing them honest numbers would scare them into supporting reform. It was the political equivalent of asking a club of tax-exempt elites to vote themselves a tax bill. The notables listened, examined the figures, and largely refused. They argued that such drastic measures could not be approved by a hand-picked body, and insisted that only the Estates General, an institution that had not been convened since 1614, could legitimately decide such questions. You cannot expect a structure to fix itself when the people profiting from the broken parts hold the tools. The Assembly of Notables was not a failed meeting. It was evidence of a ruling class so protected by privilege that they could not recognize that the ground beneath them was cracking. The Estates General was finally summoned, The Third Estate asserted itself as a national assembly. Paris exploded, and by October 1789, the king was essentially a prisoner in his own capital. France had its revolution. The fiscal crisis, however, did not vanish with the king's old ministers. The new revolutionary leadership needed funds immediately. Their solution was bold and dangerous. They identified the largest single landowner in France, the Catholic Church, and nationalized its property. Overnight, enormous swaths of land moved from church control to the state. To turn this into usable money, they created paper notes called assignats, initially backed by the value of those seized lands. The idea was to issue assignats, sell off land, use the proceeds to retire the notes, and straighten out the finances. For a brief moment, it looked like a clever workaround. But the temptation to print more never goes away. Instead of tying new issues strictly to land sales, the government used the printing press again and again to cover expenses. As more assignats flooded the economy without being retired, their value fell. Inflation accelerated. Savings were eroded. Economic instability deepened. A system that was supposed to rest on solid land ended up resting on increasingly worthless paper. As if that were not enough, the monarchy then managed to commit a political and financial self-own. In June 1791, Louis XVI tried to escape France with his family, heading toward the frontier and potential support from other monarchies. The journey, known as the Flight to Varennes, failed. They were recognized, arrested, and brought back to Paris. The attempt shattered whatever residual trust remained between king and people. Investors and citizens alike saw that the monarch was not a reluctant partner in reform, but someone actively seeking help from foreign powers. Confidence dropped further. The assignats, already weak, fell more. Wealthy individuals who had not already done so moved assets out of France wherever possible. Capital flight accelerated. When elites no longer believe in their own state's future, they leave. Their money goes first. By 1793, matters had deteriorated into something close to chaos. Louis XVI had been executed. Foreign coalitions were attacking France from multiple directions. The economy was sinking under hyperinflation and hoarding. In that environment, the radical Jacobins, led by figures like Maximilien Robespierre, turned to coercion. They introduced the law of the maximum, imposing strict ceilings on prices for essentials like bread, wine, and fuel. Violating these price controls could be treated as treason, with the guillotine as the ultimate penalty. It was an attempt to freeze an economy in place with fear. But you cannot legislate away scarcity by decree. Price caps set too low discourage production and legal trade. Farmers and merchants who could not make a profit at official prices simply stopped bringing goods to market. Black markets expanded. Urban shortages grew even worse. The state had tried to override basic supply and demand by threatening death, only to find that this created new distortions and pushed more of the economy into the shadows. When your domestic system is collapsing, your money is inflating into oblivion, and social tension is exploding, you might be tempted to look outward. Starting in 1792, revolutionary France declared war on European monarchies, beginning a period of nearly continuous conflict that would last into the Napoleonic era. Officially, it was about spreading revolutionary ideals. In practice, war was also a way to strip wealth from others. French armies were expected to live off the land, meaning they took food, supplies, and valuables from conquered territories. Napoleon's Italian campaign in the late 1790s was, among other things, a highly organized series of state-sponsored robberies. Art, gold and cash flowed back to Paris, propping up a government that had run out of conventional revenue. A state that finances itself through conquest is trapped in a cycle. To maintain the system, you need new victories, new indemnities, new loot. When victories stop, the underlying fragility is exposed. War temporarily covered the cracks, but deepened the long-term dependence on expansion and military power. After a decade of financial experiments, political purges, wars, and shortages, the French population was exhausted. They had replaced a king with committees and councils, but the currency was still weak, the economy still shaky, and the political system still unstable. The Directory government, which took over in the mid-1790s, was widely seen as corrupt and ineffective. By 1799, France looked like a failing corporation in search of new management. Into that vacuum stepped Napoleon Bonaparte. His coup in November 1799 was more than a military move. It was a promise of financial and administrative order after 10 years of crisis. Napoleon's regime quickly established the Bank of France in 1800, reorganized taxation, and stabilized the currency. He did not restore the old privileges of the Ancien Regime, but he did restore predictability. For many French people, the trade felt acceptable. They had lost a king who could not manage the books and gained an emperor who, at least for a time, could. The French Revolution shows how deeply finances and power are entangled. A broken tax system, irresponsible borrowing, regressive burdens on the poor, clumsy experiments with paper money, and attempts to micromanage prices all fed into a broader collapse of trust. When enough people cannot feed their families while watching elites live in theatrical luxury, the social contract frays and then snaps. The pattern is depressingly familiar. Extreme inequality fuels fiscal crisis. Fiscal crisis leads to improvisation and short-term fixes. Those fixes create new distortions and social anger. Social anger opens the door to radical solutions and strong figures, promising order, even if the cost is liberty. The next time you hear a government promise that you can cut taxes for the wealthiest without consequences, or solve deep structural issues by printing more money, or hold prices down indefinitely by decree, remember how that worked out for 18th century France. Fiscal incompetence does not stay confined to ledgers. It spills into streets, parliaments, and eventually, history books. In a world where many countries today are wrestling with high inequality, heavy public debts, and rising living costs for ordinary people, the echoes of 1789 are hard to ignore. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it often rhymes, and sometimes the rhyme sounds uncomfortably familiar. If you want to keep learning how past financial disasters shape the world you live in now, and how today's decisions might be setting up the next round, subscribe to Chill Financial Disasters so you are here for the next cautionary tale.